The late August sun, heavy and golden, slanted through the west-facing windows of the kitchen, painting stripes across the cool flagstone floor. Eleanor Vance, Ellie, watched the dust motes dance in the light, a small, almost imperceptible frown line etching itself between her brows. It was the kind of light that usually filled her with a sense of languid contentment, the kind that illuminated the rich wood of the custom-built cabinetry she'd designed, and Mark, her husband, had enthusiastically approved. Their house in Oak Haven, a meticulously restored Victorian, was a testament to their shared decade, a tangible narrative of their life together. Every room, every carefully chosen antique, every hue on the walls whispered of partnership. But lately, a different whisper had begun to thread its way through the familiar comforts, a discordant note in the symphony of their domesticity. Ellie, at 38, was in a period of deliberate fallowness. The urban renewal project she'd spearheaded had been a monumental success, lauded in architectural journals, but it had drained her to the core. The ensuing career break was meant to be a time of replenishment, of quiet contemplation before she embarked on her long-held dream, her own small, fiercely independent architectural firm. Mark had been supportive, as always. "Take all the time you need, Elle," he'd said, his arm a familiar weight around her shoulders. "You've earned it." Yet the stillness she craved felt unsettled. It wasn't just her own creative mind, accustomed to the rigors of design and problem-solving, now turning inward with a sometimes uncomfortable intensity. It was Mark. He was more preoccupied than usual, his gaze often distant even when she spoke directly to him. His phone, once casually left on the kitchen counter or bedside table, now seemed tethered to his person, its screen angled away with a subtle, almost unconscious defensiveness. When she'd commented on his increased workload at the finance firm, he just sighed. "End of quarter. New directives. You know how it is." And she had, or thought she had. Their garden, a riot of late summer blooms, dahlias like explosions of color, roses breathing their last fragrant sighs, was her current solace. She spent hours there, weeding, deadheading, feeling the soil between her fingers, a grounding ritual. But even amidst the vibrant life, an unnameable anxiety pricked at her. It was the same disquiet she'd felt years ago, in her early 20s, when Mr. Henderson, her first mentor, a man whose integrity she'd revered, was exposed for systematic fraud. The memory still sent a cold sliver through her, the shock, the sickening lurch of disbelief, the bitter taste of her own naivety. Mark had been instrumental in helping her rebuild her trust in her own judgment then, his steadfastness a balm. This particular evening, the air was thick with the promise of a coming thunderstorm. Mark was late, a text message citing a last-minute client dinner. Ellie had prepared a light salad, the vibrant greens and reds a stark contrast to the growing gray outside. She needed the warranty for the new induction hob. A small quirk had developed in one of the rings. Mark had scanned and saved all household documents on his laptop. "Easier to find," he'd said with his usual efficiency. His laptop sat on the antique bureau in their study. Opening it, she navigated to the household folder. As the document list populated, a small, unobtrusive notification pinged in the corner of the screen. A messaging app, one she didn't recognize, was open. A name glowed, Serafina Sky. A flicker of something, not quite suspicion, more a raw, unwelcome curiosity, made her hesitate. It felt like an intrusion, yet the app was open, visible. Her gaze snagged on the last visible message from this Serafina. "You just get me, Mark. It's like breathing real air after being underwater." Ellie's breath caught. Her heart gave a painful thud. Underwater? What did that mean? She scrolled up, a tremor starting in her hands. Mark's reply, "The feeling is mutual, S. Some days thinking of our talks is the only thing that gets me through." The words leaped off the screen, searing themselves into her mind. Gets him through what? Their life? Her? More messages, a cascade of them. Shared frustrations about work, yes, but woven through with something far more intimate. Private jokes she didn't understand. References to our little escapes, to moments of true connection. A message from Serafina, counting the minutes until our next coffee. That little place is our sanctuary, isn't it? And Mark, it is. Away from all the noise. The noise. Was she the noise? Ellie felt a wave of nausea so intense she had to grip the edge of the bureau. The room seemed to tilt. The air, thick with impending rain, now felt suffocating. This wasn't just a colleague. This was a language of emotional intimacy, a shared secret world that excluded her entirely. The casual endearment S, the almost poetic yearning. It was a betrayal sharper, deeper than any physical act could have been in that first shattering moment. Her mind, the meticulous architect's mind, began to race, replaying recent weeks, months. Mark's distraction, his phone, his late nights. Each instance, once dismissed as stress, now reconfigured itself into a piece of a horrifying new design. The foundation of their carefully constructed life, the sanctuary she believed was unbreachable, had just developed a gaping, terrifying crack. The first fat raindrops began to spatter against the window pane, like accusations. Ellie closed the laptop with a shaking hand, the click of the lid echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the study. The scent of ozone filled the air, heavy and metallic, like the taste of fear in her mouth. She stood there for a long time, motionless, the vibrant colors of the garden visible through the window now muted by the storm, mirroring the sudden, brutal draining of color from her own world. The storm broke with a theatrical fury that night, mirroring the tempest inside Ellie. She lay beside Mark in their bed, the space between them a desolate, unbridgeable chasm. His breathing was even, deep in sleep, while hers was shallow, caught in her throat. Every nerve ending felt exposed, abraded. The words from the screen were branded on her eyelids, breathing real air, our sanctuary gets me through. Confrontation, her first instinct, felt like stepping off a cliff in the dark. What if he denied it? Gaslighted her. Called her jealous, insecure. The meticulous part of her, the architect who needed blueprints before building, recoiled. She needed more than fleeting, devastating messages. She needed to understand the terrain of this betrayal before she navigated it. The days that followed were a torment of hypervigilance. Mark's every gesture, every intonation was scrutinized. His phone, now an object of almost sinister significance, was rarely out of his sight. When he smiled at her, it felt like a performance. Their conversations, once easy, were stilted, punctuated by her monosyllabic replies and his slightly puzzled, slightly wary glances. The house, their shared creation, began to feel like a beautifully appointed prison. The scent of his cologne, once comforting, now carried a faint, imagined trace of someone else's perfume. She found herself wandering through the rooms, touching objects. A ceramic bowl they'd bought on their honeymoon in Italy, a framed photo of them laughing on a windswept beach. Each memory was now tainted, overlaid with a question. Was he already distant then? Was I blind? The garden, her refuge, was succumbing to autumn's slow decay. The dahlias, once so defiant in their brilliance, were browning at the edges. Leaves, gold and russet, carpeted the lawn, a poignant shroud. The shortening days, the creeping chill in the air, seemed to seep into her bones, an external reflection of the cold dread that had taken root in her heart. Sleep became a battlefield. She'd drift into uneasy dreams, only to be jolted awake by fragments of the messages, her heart pounding. During the day, a leaden fatigue settled over her. Food tasted like ash. Her reflection in the mirror was a stranger, pale, haunted-eyed, the meticulous architect now a woman adrift. The thought of a private investigator had surfaced early, a shocking, shameful idea. It felt like something from a sordid television drama, not her life, not the life she had so carefully curated, but the need for truth, for something concrete beyond the ephemeral glow of a screen, gnawed at her. The memory of Mr. Henderson's betrayal, the way the facts had eventually brutally cut through the fog of her disbelief, spurred her on. She couldn't build on uncertainty, not in her work, not in her life. After a particularly agonizing week of feigned normalcy, of polite dinners where the silence screamed louder than any argument, she found herself hunched over her own laptop, late at night, typing Private Investigator Oak Haven into the search bar. Each click felt like a small betrayal of her own values, yet also a desperate act of self-preservation. She found Alastair Finch's website. Discreet, professional, confidential, it promised. He was a retired police detective. There was a photo, a man in his late 50s, kind eyes, a face that suggested quiet competence rather than predatory intrigue. She drafted an email, her fingers trembling, then deleted it. Finally, she picked up the phone. Their first meeting was in a quiet, anonymous cafe miles from Oak Haven. Mr. Finch was as his photo suggested, calm, gray-haired, his suit unassuming. He listened patiently as Ellie, her voice low and shaky, recounted her discovery, stumbling over the words that felt so alien on her tongue, emotional affair, secret messages. She handed him a printed sheet with Mark's details, Sarah Chen's screen name, and the snippets of conversation she'd memorized. She felt a burning shame exposing the intimate failure of her marriage to a stranger. Mr. Finch simply nodded. "These things are distressing, Mrs. Vance. My purpose is to provide you with factual information so you can make informed decisions. Nothing more, nothing less. His lack of judgment was, paradoxically, a small comfort. A week later, the first report arrived via a secure email link. Ellie opened it with a thumping heart. It contained photographs. Mark and a woman, Sarah Chen, her identity now confirmed, laughing over coffee at a small, out-of-the-way cafe. Another of them walking in a park, their heads close together, their body language intimate. Dates, times, locations, all meticulously documented. They were meetings clearly outside of work, clandestine, charged with a private energy. The images were like hammer blows. Seeing it, documented in stark black and white and undeniable color, made it irrevocably real. The little escapes were not just words. This was happening. She drove to her sister Clara's house, the report clutched in her hand like a toxic artifact. Clara, a psychologist, lived in a small, book-filled apartment that always felt like a haven of calm rationality. She listened without interruption as Ellie poured out the story, the tears finally coming, hot and furious. "Oh, Ellie?" Clara said softly, her arm around her sister's shaking shoulders. "I'm so sorry." She didn't offer platitudes or easy answers. She let Ellie weep, then made her tea, strong and sweet. "What do I do, Clara?" Ellie finally whispered, her voice raw. "How do I even?" "Right now," Clara said, her gaze steady and compassionate. "You breathe. You absorb this. You've been dealt a terrible blow. The doing will come, but first you need to acknowledge the wound." Clara spoke about the nature of betrayal, the grief, the anger, the confusion, normalizing Ellie's chaotic emotions. "He's made choices, Ellie. You are not responsible for those choices, but you are responsible for how you navigate this, for your own well-being." Clara's words were a lifeline in the storm. But even as Ellie clung to them, a deeper, more insidious fear was taking root. If Mark could construct this secret emotional world, what else was she unaware of? The crack in the veneer was widening, threatening to swallow her whole. Mr. Finch had mentioned he would also do a standard background verification, just to ensure all of Mark's declared information was consistent. Routine, he'd called it. Ellie, lost in the immediate pain of the affair, had barely registered it. Autumn tightened its grip on Oakhaven. The last roses in Ellie's garden blackened with the first hard frost, their fragile beauty surrendering to the inevitable decay. The sky was a perpetual canvas of gray, mirroring the landscape of Ellie's inner world. She moved through her days in a fog of subdued misery, the initial shock having given way to a gnawing, persistent ache. Mark, sensing her withdrawal, had made tentative overtures of concern. "Are you okay, Elle? You seem distant." His voice, with a carefully modulated solicitude, now grated on her nerves like nails on a chalkboard. How dare he feign concern when he was the architect of her pain? Mr. Finch's second report arrived on a particularly bleak Tuesday morning. Ellie had been staring out the kitchen window, watching a solitary crow peck at the frozen lawn, when the email notification pinged. Her stomach clenched. She'd almost convinced herself there would be nothing more, that the affair, however devastating, was the full extent of it. She opened the secure link, her breath held captive in her chest. The report began, as expected, with a confirmation of Mark's employment history, his educational background, details she already knew, details that formed the bedrock of their shared narrative. Then she reached a section titled Undisclosed Prior Marital Status. Her vision blurred. She blinked, forcing her eyes to focus. The words swam, then sharpened into a horrifying clarity. Subject Mark Jonathan Vance was previously married to Isabel Reyes. Marriage certificate dated June 12th, year 18 years prior, Lanton County, Nevada. Divorce decree dated September 3rd, year 15 years prior. One child documented from this union, Lily Vance, born March 7th, year 17 years prior. Current whereabouts of Isabel Reyes and Lily Vance are unknown, believed to be out of state. No record of ongoing contact or support from subject. Ellie read it again and again. Each word was a hammer blow, pulverizing the foundations of her reality. A previous marriage. A child. A daughter named Lily. The air rushed from her lungs as if she'd been physically struck. The neatly typed report slipped from her numb fingers, fluttering to the flagstone floor. She sank into a kitchen chair, her body trembling violently. This wasn't a crack in the veneer. This was a sinkhole, an abyss, and she was falling. The emotional affair with Sarah Chen, so consuming just weeks ago, now seemed almost trivial in comparison. This was not about a recent lapse in judgment, a fleeting search for external validation. This was about a fundamental, calculated deception that stretched back to the very beginning of their relationship. He had built their life, their 10 years together, on a lie of omission, so profound it was tantamount to a complete fabrication of his identity. Her mind reeled, a chaotic slideshow of memories. Their first dates, when he'd spoken of his 20s as a time of solitary focus on his career, of finding himself after university. His quiet, almost melancholic moments she'd attributed to work stress or a thoughtful nature. His reluctance to talk extensively about his family beyond his aging parents. All these fragments now rearranged themselves into a monstrous new mosaic, one where the central figure was a stranger. Who was this man she had loved, shared her dreams with, built a home with? Who was Mark Vance? A wave of nausea, more potent than the first, washed over her. She stumbled to the sink, gagging, but nothing came up. It was a sickness of the soul, a profound revulsion at the depth of the deceit. The beautiful sunlit kitchen, her meticulously designed sanctuary, suddenly felt alien, contaminated. The whole house, every room filled with shared memories, seemed to mock her with its false narrative of happiness. She thought of Lily, a 17-year-old girl somewhere, Mark's daughter, a child he had apparently abandoned, erased from his life as easily as he had erased her mother. What kind of man did that? And what kind of man then presented himself as a pillar of stability and integrity, wooing another woman with promises of a shared, honest future? The betrayal was so immense, so consuming, it was almost surreal. Ellie felt a terrifying sense of disorientation, as if the solid ground beneath her feet had dissolved. Her own judgment, her ability to perceive truth, felt utterly compromised. How could she have lived with him for a decade and not sense this colossal void, this hidden continent of his past? The shame of her own blindness was a fresh, searing pain. She picked up the phone, her hand shaking so badly she could barely dial Clara's number. When her sister answered, Ellie couldn't speak, only a choked, animalistic sob escaped her. "Ellie? Ellie, what is it? What's happened?" Clara's voice, usually so calm, was sharp with alarm. Clara, it's not just, there's more." Ellie finally managed, the words torn from her. "A marriage, a child. He never told me." There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. Then Clara said very softly, "Oh my God, Ellie, I'm coming over right now, don't be alone." Clara arrived within 20 minutes, her face etched with concern. Ellie was still at the kitchen table, the report lying beside her like a death certificate for her marriage. She looked up at her sister, her eyes vacant, pupils dilated with shock and despair. Clara gently took the report, her expression hardening as she read. When she finished, she looked at Ellie, her professional composure momentarily eclipsed by a profound sisterly sorrow. "This is monstrous, Ellie." For the rest of the day, Clara stayed, a quiet, steady presence. She didn't push Ellie to talk, but simply sat with her, made her tea she didn't drink, and listened when Ellie finally began to articulate the fragmented shards of her broken reality. "Everything is a lie, Clara," Ellie whispered, her voice hollow. "Our whole life, every anniversary, every shared dream, it was all built on his secret. He looked me in the eyes for 10 years and lied. Who is he? He's someone who made a devastating series of choices long ago and recently," Clara said gently. "Someone who chose deceit over honesty, concealment over courage. That's on him, Ellie. Not you. Your love was real, your trust was real. What he did with that is his burden." But Ellie couldn't separate herself from it yet. She felt implicated in the lie, a fool duped by a master manipulator. The meticulous architect, so proud of her perception, had failed to see the fatal flaw in the most important structure of her life. The days that followed were a descent into a dark, disorienting fog. Sleep offered no escape, her dreams haunted by faceless women and lost children. The house became a mausoleum of her dead illusions. She avoided looking at photographs, at objects that screamed of shared intimacy. The vibrant hues of their life had leached into a monochrome of grief. The career she had put on hold, the dream of her own firm, felt impossibly distant, a relic from another lifetime, a lifetime when she believed in foundational truths. Now she questioned everything, most painfully, herself. Mr. Henderson's betrayal years ago had been a tremor. This was an earthquake that had leveled everything. The fog of Ellie's initial breakdown slowly began to lift, not into clarity, but into a cold, hard resolve. The grief was still a raw, gaping wound, but beneath it, a different kind of strength was coalescing. The strength of someone who has touched bottom and found, to her surprise, that the abyss hasn't swallowed her whole. She had to know. She had to hear it from him. Not for absolution, not for reconciliation, but for the stark, brutal truth to be laid bare between them. She spent 2 days preparing, not in a logistical sense, but an emotional one. She reread Mr. Finch's reports, the words no longer blurring, but etching themselves onto her consciousness with chilling precision. She looked at the faded copy of Mark's marriage certificate to Isabel Reyes, the names alien and yet inextricably linked to the man she thought she knew. She stared at the grainy photocopied image Mr. Finch had managed to unearth. A much younger Mark, a faint smile on his lips, standing beside a dark-haired woman holding a toddler. Lily, his daughter. The image was a spear to her heart. She chose a Thursday evening. Mark had a tendency to work late on Thursdays, often returning tired and less guarded. The late autumn day had been relentlessly gray, a persistent drizzle falling, making the world outside seem as weary and depleted as she felt. She set the stage with a chilling deliberation she hadn't known she possessed. She made sure the lighting in the living room was subdued, casting long shadows. She placed Mr. Finch's reports, including the damning photograph, in a plain manila envelope on the coffee table. When Mark came home, shaking off the rain from his coat, he found her sitting in her usual armchair, not reading, not sketching, just waiting. The television was off. The usual comforting sounds of their evening routine, music, the clatter of pans, were absent. An unnerving stillness permeated the house. "Ellie, you okay?" he asked, his voice tinged with the familiar, slightly forced concern he'd adopted recently. "You didn't answer my texts." "I was busy," she said, her voice flat, devoid of inflection. It was a new voice, one he didn't recognize. He came closer, sensing the shift in atmosphere. "Bad day?" He reached out to touch her shoulder. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, but he caught it. He let his hand drop. "What's wrong?" Ellie looked at him then, truly looked at him, as if seeing him for the first time. The familiar lines of his face, the way his hair fell across his forehead, the scent of his skin, all of it overlaid now with the grotesque mask of the stranger he had become. "We need to talk, Mark," she said, her voice still eerily calm. He sat on the sofa opposite her, a knot of apprehension tightening in his stomach. He knew this wasn't about a burnt dinner or a forgotten errand. Ellie gestured to the manila envelope. "I think you should look at this." He picked it up, his brow furrowed. As he pulled out the contents, his face began to change. First, confusion, as he saw the surveillance photos of him and Sarah Chen, the cafe, the park, then a flush of anger, defensiveness. "What is this? Are you having me followed?" "Answer the question, Mark. Who is Serafina Sky to you?" Her voice was like ice. He started to bluster. "She's a colleague. We talk, that's all. She's going through a hard time. You're blowing this out of proportion, Ellie. It's just friendship." He attempted a dismissive laugh, but it caught in his throat. "Friendship?" Ellie's voice rose slightly, the first crack in her composure. "You just get me, Mark. It's like breathing real air after being underwater. The feeling is mutual, S. Some days, thinking of our talks is the only thing that gets me through. Is that how you talk to all your friends going through a hard time?" Mark's face paled. The bravado deflated. "Okay, so maybe the messages were a bit much. It got a little out of hand. But it's not what you think, Elle. Nothing physical happened. It was just an escape. Things have been stressful." "An escape," she repeated, the words tasting like poison. "From what, Mark? From me? From our life?" She didn't wait for an answer. Her gaze dropped to the other papers in his hand. "But that's not even the most interesting part, is it?" He looked down, his eyes falling on the copy of the marriage certificate, then the photograph. His hand began to tremble. All color drained from his face, leaving it a sickly grayish hue. He stared at the image of himself, Isabel, and the small child as if seeing a ghost. The air in the room grew thick, charged with unspoken history. "Isabel Reyes," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper, yet each syllable landed with the force of a physical blow. "Lily Vance, your wife, your daughter." Mark just stared at the photograph, his mouth agape. The carefully constructed facade of Mark Vance, successful finance manager, devoted husband, shattered into a million pieces. "Who are they, Mark?" Ellie pressed, her voice now trembling with a tightly controlled, fueled fury. "Or should I say, who were they? Before you erased them from your life? Before you erased them from my life?" He looked up at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and a dawning, horrifying resignation. The fight had gone out of him completely. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He seemed to shrink into himself, the confident man she knew dissolving before her eyes. "I," he stammered, his voice cracking. He dropped the papers onto the coffee table as if they burned his fingers. "Ellie, I can explain." "Explain?" A harsh, brittle laugh escaped her. Explain 10 years of lies. Explain how you stood before our friends and family, promising honesty and fidelity, while an entire previous life, an entire child, was your dirty little secret. Tears began to stream down Mark's face. He buried his head in his hands, his shoulders shaking. I was going to tell you, he choked out, his voice muffled. So many times I was going to tell you, but it was so long ago. I was young, stupid. I made a mess of things. I was ashamed. Ashamed? Ellie stood up, pacing the small space in front of him like a caged animal. You were ashamed, so you built another life on top of the ruins of the first? You met me, you courted me, you married me, all while carrying this monumental deceit? Did you think it would just disappear? That Isabel and Lily would just vanish into thin air because you wished it so? It felt like another lifetime, he mumbled, looking up at her, his face ravaged. I convinced myself it wasn't relevant. I was terrified if you knew, you wouldn't want me. I loved you, Ellie. I didn't want to lose you. Love? The word was a bitter scoff. You don't know the first thing about love, Mark. Love is built on truth, on vulnerability, not on this elaborate, cruel charade. She stopped in front of him, her eyes boring into his. What you felt for me wasn't love. It was convenience. A way to have a clean slate, a perfect new life, without ever having to account for the old one. The fight was over. There was nothing left but the wreckage. The silence in the room was heavy, broken by Mark's ragged sobs and Ellie's harsh, unsteady breathing. After a long, agonizing moment, Ellie spoke, her voice drained of all emotion, flat and final. I don't know who you are, Mark, and right now I don't think I want to. I need you to leave. Tonight. He looked up, his eyes pleading. Ellie, please, don't do this. We can work through this. I'll do anything. Work through it? She shook her head slowly. There's nothing left to work through. You've demolished it all. I need space, Mark. I need to breathe air that isn't filled with your lies. I need you to pack a bag and go. He saw the unyielding resolve in her eyes, the desolate finality. The fight was truly over. He had lost. Slowly, painfully, he pushed himself up from the sofa, a broken man. Without another word, he turned and walked out of the living room, the sound of his footsteps on the stairs echoing the hollow chambers of Ellie's heart. She stood alone in the shadowed room, the manila envelope still on the coffee table, a testament to the cataclysm that had just occurred. The drizzle outside had turned into a steady, mournful rain. Ellie wrapped her arms around herself, not against the cold, but against the terrifying emptiness that had just taken up residence in her life. The reckoning had come, and it had cost her everything. The click of the front door closing as Mark left was a small, definitive sound in the echoing silence of the house. It was a sound that bifurcated Ellie's life, before Mark left and after Mark left. She stood motionless in the living room for a long time, the shadows deepening around her, the only light coming from the street lamp outside, casting a pale, spectral glow on the rain-streaked windows. The house, once her sanctuary, now felt cavernous, cold, and profoundly alien. It was no longer a shared space. It was a museum of deceit, each room holding memories that were now fractured, reinterpreted, and stained. The first few days were a blur of raw, untethered grief. Sleep was a distant country she couldn't reach, her nights punctuated by vivid, agonizing replays of the confrontation, of Mark's tear-streaked face, of the devastating truth of his past. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she would wake with a jolt, her heart pounding, the reality of her shattered life crashing down on her anew. She walked through the house like a ghost, touching objects absently. Mark's side of the closet, half empty after his hasty packing, was a gaping wound. His scent lingered faintly on a forgotten sweater, a cruel olfactory reminder. The silence was the loudest sound, amplifying her own chaotic thoughts. The vibrant autumn colors outside, once a source of melancholy beauty, now seemed to mock her with their transient glory, a reminder that everything, even what seemed most solid, eventually decays and falls. Clara became her lifeline. She'd appear with groceries Ellie hadn't thought to buy, with tea Ellie didn't feel like drinking but sipped anyway under her gentle insistence. Sometimes they talked, Ellie's words fragmented, raw, as she tried to piece together the why of it all. Mark's fear, his shame, his monumental selfishness. Other times, they sat in comfortable silence, Clara's presence a quiet anchor in the storm of Ellie's emotions. Clara, drawing on her professional expertise and her own painful experience with divorce, didn't offer easy solutions but validated Ellie's pain, her anger, her confusion. There's no timeline for this kind of grief, Elle, she'd said. Allow yourself to feel it all. It's the only way through. Mark attempted contact. Texts appeared on her phone, long, rambling messages filled with remorse, self-recrimination, and desperate pleas for another chance. Voicemails, his voice thick with unshed tears, begging her to talk to him. Ellie listened to the first few, a cold knot forming in her stomach. His pain seemed genuine, but it was eclipsed by her own. She couldn't process his regret while still drowning in the consequences of his actions. She started deleting them unheard. It wasn't out of spite, but a deep, instinctual need for self-preservation. The wound was too fresh, too raw to bear the salt of his apologies. Slowly, painstakingly, fragments of Ellie began to resurface. One morning, she found herself standing before her old drafting table in the spare room, untouched for months. Dust lay thick on its surface. Almost involuntarily, her fingers traced the familiar lines of a T-square. She picked up a pencil, the cool wood familiar in her hand, and began to sketch. Not buildings, not plans, but abstract, jagged lines, swirling vortexes, forms that mirrored the turmoil inside her. There was a strange solace in giving shape to the chaos, a release in the physical act of creation, however tormented. The walks began too. Long, aimless rambles through Oak Haven's winding streets, then further afield into the frosted fields and bare woodlands that bordered the town. The crisp, early winter air bit at her cheeks, a welcome, tangible sensation in the numbness that often enveloped her. The stark beauty of the winter landscape, the intricate lace of bare branches against a steel-gray sky, the hardy green of ivy on ancient stone walls, began to speak to her in a way the dying flamboyance of autumn had not. It was a beauty of resilience, of endurance. Clara, observing these small shifts, gently suggested therapy. Someone objective to talk to, Ellie. Someone who isn't me, who isn't emotionally entangled. Ellie, who had once prided herself on her self-sufficiency, now recognized the wisdom in it. The trauma of Mark's deceit ran deeper than she could navigate alone. The first snow fell in early December, a soft, silent blanket that transformed the world overnight. Ellie stood at her kitchen window, the one where she'd watched the crow on the frozen lawn weeks before, and saw her garden transformed. The dead stalks of the dahlias, the blackened rose bushes, were now softened, ethereal, under their white mantle. It wasn't an erasure of the decay, but a new layer, a different kind of beauty emerging from the wreckage. Something shifted within her then, a subtle internal recalibration. The acute, stabbing pain was still there, but it was no longer all-consuming. It was becoming a part of her landscape, like a scar, a reminder of a wound, but also a testament to survival. She thought of Mark, not with the searing anger or profound sadness that had characterized her initial reactions, but with a kind of weary detachment. His betrayal had been catastrophic, his choices unforgivable in the context of their shared life. But he was also, she began to see, a deeply flawed, perhaps broken individual, trapped by his own past and his inability to confront it with courage. This didn't excuse him, but it began to separate his pathology from her own self-worth. His failure was not hers. The winter months passed, each day a small increment of healing, of rebuilding. Ellie continued her therapy sessions, slowly untangling the complex knot of grief, betrayal, and shattered trust. She learned to articulate her anger without being consumed by it, to acknowledge her sadness without letting it drown her. She began the arduous process of forgiving herself, for not seeing, for trusting too readily, for the future she had envisioned that would never be. Forgiving Mark was a more distant, complex prospect, less about absolution for him and more about releasing herself from the corrosive power of bitterness that bound her to the past. Her architectural sketches evolved. The jagged lines softened, the vortexes opened into more expansive forms. Ideas for her own firm, once a distant, almost forgotten dream, began to resurface, now imbued with a new clarity, a new purpose. It would be a firm built on transparency, on integrity, on creating spaces that were honest and true, qualities she now valued above all else. One crisp, late winter afternoon, as the sun hung low, casting long, clear shadows, that Ellie was in her study, now truly her study. She was working on a preliminary design for a small community library, a project she was considering as her first independent venture. The lines on the paper were clean, confident. There was a quiet hum of absorption around her, the familiar focus she had missed for so long. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It was quieter, yes, but it was her quiet. She had started to reclaim it, room by room, memory by memory, not by erasing Mark, but by superimposing her own present, her own future onto its framework. She'd rearranged furniture, brought in new plants, filled the spaces with the music she loved. A letter had arrived from Mark a few weeks prior, passed on by his lawyer as they began the unavoidable discussions about the divorce. It wasn't a plea for reconciliation, but a stark, unvarnished account of his past with Isabel and Lily, his shame, his regrets, the choices that had led him down his path of deceit. He wrote of trying to locate Lily, of wanting to make amends, however belatedly. Ellie read it with a strange sense of detachment. It was his story, his burden to carry. It no longer had the power to destroy her. She looked out the window. In the garden, beneath the retreating snow, she could see the determined green tips of snowdrops and crocuses pushing through the cold earth, the first tenacious signs of spring. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips. Ellie Vance was not the same woman she had been last August. The meticulous architect who believed in flawless foundations had learned that life structures are often built on imperfect ground, that cracks are inevitable, and that true strength lies not in avoiding them, but in how one chooses to rebuild after the collapse. She was warier, certainly, the memory of betrayal a permanent etching on her soul. But she was also stronger, more self-aware, more deeply connected to her own core. The future was an unwritten blueprint. Whether Mark would ever truly find redemption, whether their paths might cross again in some distant, unimaginable future where true healing and radical honesty had somehow occurred for both of them, was an open question, and one that no longer consumed her. Her focus was on the present, on the quiet strength she had found within herself, on the designs taking shape under her hand. She turned back to her drafting table, picked up her pencil, and drew a confident, clear line. It was a line pointing forward. The house of veiled truths had been deconstructed, its deceptions exposed. Now Eleanor Vance was designing her own truth on her own terms, under a sky that, however uncertain, held the promise of a new dawn.